On today's video, we're going to be talking about xylazine in the state of Florida. This is a drug that is a sedative and a muscle relaxant that is used in the veterinary field. It is often added to heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl to make its effect stronger. Similarly, medications like gabapentin that are used for nerve pain can also be added to stack or to multiplier effect anything it is added to. Thus, on today's video, we're going to be talking about these drugs that are less talked about but are having a dramatic effect on the state of Florida. Now, the epicenter for xylazine deaths have been Sarasota, Bradenton, along with the outskirts of Jacksonville. Now, in the state of Florida, the medical examiners are divided into districts, and this is the coverage map. Every district has its own people, and one district can be very good, while another can be very bad. And we're not just talking about the analytics of deaths, we're also talking about how well these individuals do their jobs, with some of these districts having a great reputation for accuracy, while other districts having very questionable intentions. Now, most people would assume that homicides and overdoses is where most of the concealment or information manipulation would take place in these analytics, but you'll be surprised to know that really those aren't the categories that are the most questionable. For one, self-inflicted deaths seem to be very questionable because many times when somebody powerful in law enforcement or somebody that has a lot of ties in the community, power, you could say, those individuals are many times able to help get a case thrown into that category, which means that the investigation will not be criminal. Among those questionable areas are the District of St. Johns County, who quote unquote pretty much says that many times an overdose can practically be submitted as self-inflicted, and thus it falls under the category of the S word. And you really got to think in different layers here because different substances have different percentages of accidental, while it also varies from district to district. In other words, while the total for Florida Health is one single number, it's coming from different districts, different counties, and those counties and districts are categorizing things the way they want or the way they perceive. Take St. Johns County, the area of St. Augustine, which on paper is the safest county in Florida. Currently, their homicide rate is 3 people per every 100,000, which is about half the state average, making it the safest county in the state. The area of St. Augustine, interestingly enough, they had 23 self-inflicted deaths, which is almost 2 a month. So imagine a county that only had 4 homicides for the whole county, but they had 23 self-inflicted gunshot wound deaths. So a county trying to have the best analytics for homicides in the state, but then they have other categories that are considerably higher, like self-inflicted by gunshot. Those types of counties raise a lot of red flags, and it would make us suspicious of why, if your county on paper has just a low homicide rate, the questionable categories where a death could fall under, misappropriately falling under that category, or the most realistic scenario, the individuals involved are of high caliber, individuals in law enforcement, individuals with connections to local offices, and these types of individuals are usually the particular cases that have enough influence over the medical examiner's offices or the directors to be able to influence them. Without a doubt, the overwhelming majority of these cases are individuals who have connections to people in power locally and are able to have some type of swing and power over other people in local offices like law enforcement, medical examiner's office. And these are the most notable, notorious cases. We're talking cases like Brian Laundrie in Port Charlotte, Northport, Florida, Gabby Patino case down there. Those are the types of cases where people are more skeptical because the individuals involved happen to have local influence. And like that, there's been a few cases in the state of Florida where the individuals who are in question for a crime are also vinculated with people in high places, and it makes for a very skeptical case investigation. Many times these instances are usually going to be classified under those mystery categories: undetermined, self-inflicted. Recently in Lee County, Florida, 188 officers donated money to the campaigns of people in local offices. The sheriff Marcino himself is allegedly being investigated by the FBI for kickback schemes. So when you have a state like Florida where corruption has become endemic to the law enforcement system, where individuals' positions in local government offices are placed by other individuals, I owe you, you owe me, I get you him, you get me him. It's this nepotism within local government in Florida that everybody owes their job to somebody else because they were placed in that job by giving a contribution. Now, I recently made a video where people are buying their jobs in Florida. In other words, if you want to get a placement in a company, it's not the person with the best pedigree. It's not the person with the best application. It's the person who walks in there and pretty much buys their job. And many people who are office individuals in Florida that are holding a local office, they got in their job not because they had the best resume, but because they paid somebody the year salary that job pays. In other words, they bought their job. So if there's a job that pays $200,000 a year and you paid somebody $200,000 to get that job, that individual is now indebted to the other. So when one of those individuals is involved with something like a homicide and they've placed people in law enforcement and medical examiners' offices, and the list goes on and on of the I owe you, you owe me scenario in the state of Florida, endemic to the nepotism and the corruption of local governments, and the people who get in these local offices obtain those positions by nothing more than a questionable vinculation to another individual. That is when these type of scenarios take place. So you imagine if the person who placed you in the job position you are in is now being questioned over the death of his wife, and you're the medical examiner or your local law enforcement or a detective, you're in a very compromised position where these individuals may outright tell you, I got you your job. If you want to keep your job, you're going to have to just cooperate on this one. And this is a situation that many people find themselves in. Well, they obtain their job through some type of illicit method like the ones I've talked about. And then now those individuals are still compromised to the person that got them in that position. It's not like all of a sudden you're going to help this crooked person get rid of the charges for what happened to his wife. It's more like, no, you're indebted to that person because what they did for you in getting you your job. So now that they're in this little hurdle, you're the one that's got to bail them out. And that's why you see these cases of notoriety in Florida. It seems like everything falls in these people's laps to get away with these crimes because it's already set up. It's a rigged system after all. And what people don't understand about these salary-based government jobs is that people are not qualifying for these jobs. They're buying these jobs. So without a doubt, if you're referring to somebody in local office or these local cases of notoriety that make national news and everybody has a conspiracy theory about, in the case of those people, it's very clear that resoundingly the issue comes down to nepotism. And this isn't just politics, it's banking, it's the financial sector, it's entire industries work like that. But those are individual cases, and while they are the most notable and notorious, they don't really constitute a disformity in analytics. So what we're talking about today are disformities in analytics, things that simply do not add up. And when it comes to questionable analytics regarding drug deaths in the state of Florida, nothing is more resounding than what's happening in Sarasota, Florida. Sarasota, Florida had 76 people die from xylazine. That is just absolutely insane. Go figure, Miami being a much larger metro only had 43. Not only did Sarasota have the highest sheer number in the state of Florida, but they were also the most likely to not consider it the cause of death. In other words, they're like, oh yeah, there is xylazine here, but it wasn't the cause of death. And you're wondering, why would these individuals not want xylazine deaths to occur in their county? Well, it's very simple. Xylazine is a very scary word. This is the type of word and news story that makes detectives and commissioners lose their jobs, eyebrows get raised, especially when you're abnormally high in your city, county, or metro. Now notice that Pensacola had 1 and they said it was the cause. The same thing can be said for Tallahassee. Daytona had 23 and 23 were cause. Orlando had 5 and 5 were the cause. Panama had 1 was the cause. Fort Myers had 25 and 25 were the cause. Sanford had 1 and 1 was the cause. In other words, medical examiners are like, yeah, if this is in your system, it is what killed you. At least that's what they thought in Sanford, Fort Myers, Panama City, Orlando, Daytona, Tallahassee, and Pensacola. But Sarasota, for example, with 76 cases, they're like, well, only about 18 of these were actually the cause. Now, isn't that a variable? Couldn't that change from place to place? Yeah, it absolutely could, except for not even with prescription medications from doctors does that happen. It either works or it doesn't. There isn't this wide percentage of deadly xylazine in one place and then it's not as deadly somewhere else where it's even more prevalent. That's not how this works. It really doesn't make sense why so many of these medical examiners would all agree that yes, xylazine is what's causing the deaths, but in the case of Sarasota, where the highest number exists, they believe it isn't. Now, do these substances vary from place to place? Yes. Do professionals have different opinions? Absolutely. But there's a motive behind why these analytics are in that fashion. It's suspicious that the area that has the highest number in the state, abnormally high number, would also want to downplay the importance of that substance in the deaths here. And that in itself is indicative of how little faith we should have in these drug overdose analytics. We can say the round numbers or something like this, but to solidly believe in these numbers, you would have to be a complete fool. When you see how much the analytics vary and the likelihood of one county blaming one thing while the other county doesn't, all that would indicate that despite the fact we assume that these numbers that go to Florida Health are uniform, these particular counties are manipulating the information. And that doesn't even indicate that it's the medical examiners that are making these determinations. It could be their directors. It could be a commissioner with a lot of power. Hey, you figure it out. Somebody somewhere doesn't want these numbers to come out. And if there is this much discordance in the work of medical examiner's office and they vary that much in opinion from place to place, then we can assume that the analytics that we are getting about drug overdoses in the United States and what is actually causing those deaths is nothing but somebody's opinion. We know that xylazine deaths are abnormally high in Sarasota. However, the medical examiner's office here don't think it's related. They don't think it's the actual cause of these deaths. And you know, Naples raises eyebrows too with the percentage of people that died that they don't think are related. St. Petersburg, Florida also had an abnormally high number. So we can say that the Tampa Bay metro area and Jacksonville are the ones that are suffering the most from xylazine deaths. With Fort Myers being 25 out of 25, there really isn't a reason why Naples would disproportionately not agree that it's the same cause. It's the same metropolitan area, there's just in different districts, and you would logically come to the conclusion that the supply in these counties would be the same. So we can say that St. Petersburg, Sarasota, and Naples are the three areas that are in denial about the problem, and it's a very logical denial. These are coastal counties with a lot of tourism, and they don't want the word xylazine to exist in their county. Now, heard it through the great grapevine, the state of Florida, the people higher up, do not want the word xylazine to even exist in the state of Florida. These analytics are from several years ago. The new analytics, I'm working to get them, but it's going to be tricky because the state of Florida has the practice of dropping analytics 2-3 years behind or delaying it as much as possible, because they don't really want people to understand the scope of what's happening in these counties. And they also want to be able to work out the kinks in how they're reporting their analytics. So when the public gets it, the public doesn't raise an eyebrow and say, that doesn't check out. So if it's a few years old, then it isn't current. So there's definitely some questionable practice to begin with in the state of Florida. But hearing it through the grapevine, the state of Florida doesn't want the word xylazine out there. And well, it's awfully hard to find something if you're not looking for it to begin with. Recently, I've been talking to people on the streets who believe that they were getting fent here in the Sarasota area, but when they get drug tested, there's no fent in their system. And based on the fact that it seems like the intention is to conceal what's really hurting people in the state of Florida, because these counties do not want to be the epicenter for an outbreak. If the intention is to hide when we do have an outbreak that starts to hurt people here in the state of Florida, we're not going to hear about it from Florida Health. We're not going to hear about it from the medical examiner's office because somebody is preventing them from getting that information out there. So, hey, red flag. Hey, we got a problem over here. No, that's fentanyl. That's just right fentanyl right there. Yeah, that's just my personal opinion. If you have a better explanation for these discordances in analytics, I would love to hear it. Don't stay quiet in the comment section, okay? Now, we could go over analytics all day long, but just to summarize some of these ideas that I'm explaining to you, many times it's very easy for somebody to say this is self-inflicted. Many times, these are the suburban areas, the gated communities. They don't like the H word, the homicide word, to be mentioned in these areas. So these are classified under certain more comfortable areas. And I don't know if you guys know this, if it is self-inflicted in the state of Florida, information about that case is confidential. So let's say now some individual of prestige or big name, somebody with local power gets into one of these scenarios. If it's off the bat classified as self-inflicted, the information is no longer public records, which means the rest of us don't have the ability to scrutinize if the information that's going to move forward from there is reliable or not. Now, the intention is to provide privacy to an individual. Unfortunately, we've seen even with larger cases of much more notoriety that the application is that the public gets very little information about these cases. Now, usually when you have an overdose death, fentanyl is always the number one culprit. It is present in most of these cases. But xylazine is in there. And surprisingly, the people that take prescription medications, gabapentin is in there, so is tramadol. I recently made a video talking about gabapentin and tramadol, and a lot of people made fun of me and they laughed at me, but they don't know that analytically, these two medicines actually do lead to a lot of deaths in the state of Florida, and it's used as somewhat of a enhancer or a multiplier, and it's the combination of all these different substances that many times does lead to a death. And meth is another one that is very high numerically into drugs that kill a lot of people in Florida. But when you talk about meth, they almost always pin it on the meth. But let's not discard that just because these individual drugs like gabapentin and tramadols are not exactly listed as the cause, if they're showing up in the individuals that are having these deaths, then of course they are suspicious of a contributing factor. And it's erroneous to think that only one substance had to cause the overdose. We know that in medicine combinations are very complicated, and which one is it when an individual has 5 different substances in them? It's the combination, but of course, for some reason or another, they just want to pin it on one particular substance. And I believe that the reason why they do that, and I know it's not going to be a very popular opinion with many people, is because the pharmaceutical world, those tramadols, those gabapentins, and the 50 other ones that are illegal and are being mixed with all this other bad stuff, are a serious contributing factor in their combination. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies do have the power to make sure that their brands, that their names and their products don't get caught in that confusion. So when we see many years ago, everybody knew it was the pharmaceutical companies. Now they're saying this stuff's coming from Mexico. But in reality, if you look at these numbers, it's all in a wide array of different substances that could, in one way or another, be the real culprit in a lot of these deaths. The United States is big on buying you a new toy, but not giving you the manual for it. I mean, realistically, do you really think that medical examiners in their field are going to start to point a finger at the pharmaceuticals coming from a pharmacy when they can point the finger at something that's coming illicitly from another country, when you have political motives behind all that. I mean, after all, it is the same medical profession, so are you going to go against your peers on that one? North Florida and South Florida are two very different places. You can see that the northern half of the state, meth is predominant in leading with the deaths. There's a lot more meth deaths in the northern half of the state, while in the southern half of the state, it's actually cocaine. Geographical contributions. Look at Monroe County. That's the bottom of the state, the Florida Keys. They're actually in the highest percentage for cocaine deaths. And that's very logical. The Florida Keys, close to the Caribbean, so a lot of cocaine in transit to other places stops there. And well, you end up with more cocaine deaths. So without a doubt, little regional things play into this. Like the northern half of the state is going to have more meth. The southern half of the state is going to have more cocaine. And metropolitan areas like Jacksonville and Tampa are going to have more people stepping on stuff and bringing people to ruin with overdoses. A lot of strange things happen in the self-inflicted deaths category. Take a look at St. Johns County. 23 of them were gunshot wound inflicted in a county with only 4 homicides. I mean, the self-inflicted versus homicide ratio in St. Johns County was 10-1. And it's like that in a lot of places. But it brings an interesting question why these affluent counties where rich people reside are more likely when somebody, they're more likely to consider it self-inflicted. Where if it's an urban area or another area, then it's definitely a homicide investigation. Regardless of the fact, we all know that suburban people and wealthy people move very differently than street people. But regardless, it's almost like there's two totally different categories of deaths. You have when it happens in a gated community and how it's looked at it, and when it happens, like, let's say, in an inner city and how it's looked at it. So these are very different settings. And sometimes I feel like they're letting the setting determine the outcome of how it's looked at, how it's investigated. And then add to that mix a last name that carries a little bit of power and weight, and you go figure how reliable these analytics really are. There were 471 xylazine deaths in Florida. 76 of them were in Sarasota. Now, only 11 of those deaths happened in the 18 to 25 category, and 2 of them were in Sarasota. What's alarming in Sarasota, it's the age groups that are being affected are younger than other places as well. It's a little suspicious that these analytics were transferred to present but not cause with the young people. There's red flags all over these analytics. So what's interesting about xylazine is that there's practically no information on what the source country is. Where is xylazine coming from? Mystery. Nobody knows. Well, here's something. It comes from the veterinary uses. So is it coming from Mexico? Very unlikely. There is a huge Russian and Ukrainian community here in Sarasota, and a lot of them are very affluent people in the medical field, so forth. I'm just throwing that out there. Veterinary purposes. I don't know, there's a moat aquarium over here. There's a lot of horses down there in Sarasota. Not as much as Ocala. I don't know. How do you draw the connection here between Sarasota? Why Sarasota? Interesting question. Can you wrap your head around the idea that 76 people in this district died from xylazine? That's crazy. That's just wild. Oh, I'm sorry. Only 18, according to the medical examiner's office. It was present in about 58 of them, but it wasn't the cause. Yeah, so somebody taking trank isn't. It's not gonna. It's not. But I think with this information, maybe some of you guys in the audience can grasp the picture of the reality of what's happening with drugs in Florida versus the Fox News version of what's happening in Florida. But just in case you don't believe me, here's a new story that came out just today. A former Charlotte County deputy is now, many decades later, the suspect of the death of his wife and the lover. Not one, two. A letter was found claiming it to be self-inflicted that seemed legitimate. The letter seemed legitimate. And of course, there were pill bottles in the car. So, here's a deputy, here's a, oh, I'm so sorry this happened situation, self-inflicted, right? 2 people, not 1. But again, this is just now coming out, happened decades ago here in Florida. So why wasn't he arrested for it? Because he was a deputy. Now this case is decades old and they're just bringing it up now. This is a widespread practice. When the suspects are individuals in law enforcement, or when the suspects are individuals in local offices, the handling of these situations is always questionable. And it's the law enforcement agencies that are to blame because they instinctively, instantly try to cover up for their officers, even though they are engaged in wrongdoing. And it's a practice that's even starting to become legislation in the state of Florida. They want to just automatically slap every single police officer with complete impunity from their actions, immunity from their behavior. These aren't just cases of people covering up homicides. This is the general attitude that law enforcement and even the legislature in the state of Florida has towards police officers, is to automatically defend them instead of saying, no, we have something that was done wrong and needs to be fixed. Now let's try to cover up for our brother. But as long as people in law enforcement and local offices care more about their friends, people in power like to showboat their powers and abilities that come with their positions, it sadly lends itself very well to misappropriation. And well, in the state of Florida, the cases are innumerable. And these are just the cases we know about. You have no idea how many cases exist in Florida of this nature that simply have never been talked about. As somebody who studies analytics, there's a definite correlation between administrations and foreign policy on how it affects what's going on in the streets of the United States. But I don't want to ruffle people's feathers. But the reality is that even when analytical information is conclusive on some of these things. All right, guys, and I hope today's video has been informative to you. In the state of Florida, 7,000 to 8,000 people a year are dying from overdoses. And we usually consider homicides and overdoses the most suspicious areas. But of course, that is like the small and minute section of deaths. There's actually another category that is even more astonishing and filled with corruption. But you guys are going to have to wait for that in a coming video. I mean, after all, we're just talking about manipulating some analytics locally in one county or two, or a case or two where some rich person has to cover up something. But there's something that hurts more people than overdoses, and there's a window of what the crap is going on in Florida in that category. I'm just going to say one word: accidents and deaths. But I want to hear you guys' opinion on that before I make the video in anticipation. We'll touch on that soon. What is the most malignant thing that is happening to the residents of Florida right now? All of us are being robbed left and right. There's other categories of death that are much more suspicious. Of course, like I said, homicides and overdoses is where everybody wants to point the finger and say, aha, here's something interesting. But there's actually areas that hurt more people than that, and there's more money involved in those categories. It's interesting that when people look for conspiracy theories, they're always looking in the wrong places. There is one very blatant and obvious thing that is making even a lot of people leave the state of Florida, and you just won't believe how much misappropriation happens in that particular category, because that's really where the money's at. And don't get me wrong, I really do believe that when it comes to overdoses, pharmaceutical companies are getting a huge amount of consideration by these medical examiners' offices, and that I think they're playing a huge role in what's happening here in the state of Florida, these overdoses. Of course, nobody wants to admit that, but I do believe that the legitimate pharmaceutical companies are very implicit in the overdoses that are happening in the state of Florida that are many times blamed on other substances. But again, it's all about the money. Follow the money. Where should we really be looking when it comes to these analytics? I'll let you guys guess.